In the restricted storage annex beneath the Giza Plateau's Site Museum, sealed off from the causeway tours that pass 20 meters overhead, sits a limestone relief fragment catalogued as GZ-114/C. It measures 94 centimeters across, carved on one face with a scene that has never appeared in any published excavation report. The fragment was pulled from public rotation in 1987, the same year a visiting structural engineer photographed its surface, and noted, in writing, that the object suspended above the pyramid's apex in the carving bore no resemblance to any lifting apparatus in the archaeological record. That photograph exists, that engineer's note exists, the fragment exists, sealed in a climate-controlled drawer. What does not exist is a single peer-reviewed paper addressing what is carved into it, or why the figures below are shown looking up, not lifting. It was pulled from beneath the causeway in 1987 during a routine survey of the eastern subsidiary structures, conducted by a joint Egyptian-Swiss team documenting erosion damage along the plateau's southern face. The fragment was found wedged in backfill inside a collapsed storage niche, not in situ against a wall, which is why its original architectural context was never fully established. The survey was led by Dr. Hans Brugger, a structural engineer from ETH Zurich, who had spent 11 years assessing load-bearing stress in ancient stone construction across the Mediterranean. His field log describes the fragment's condition, its find spot, and a single paragraph noting that the object depicted above the pyramid's apex bore no resemblance to any known lifting, leveling, or hauling implement documented at Giza or anywhere else in the Old Kingdom record. The Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities catalog entry from the same year classifies the fragment in one line: provenance, secondary context, subsidiary structure, subject, ceremonial, function undetermined. No dedicated study of the carving has been published since. It sits in climate-controlled storage, referenced twice in passing in two unrelated conference papers. The gap is not concealment in any formal sense. It is simply a fragment nobody with the right expertise ever returned to. What Brugger flagged in 1987 has waited 39 years for someone to ask the second question: what exactly is the object doing there?
The label carved beside the object is a compound glyph, 4 signs joined in a construction that does not appear anywhere else in the formal religious canon. Egyptologists who have examined the fragment, in the 2 brief references that exist, translate it provisionally as the hand that does not tire. That translation matters more than it sounds like it should. Hieroglyphic compounds of this grammatical type are not decorative. They are not poetic license or scribal flourish. Dynastic Egyptians used this exact construction to designate specific offices, specific classes of divine function, specific categorical roles within a rigid cosmological bureaucracy. A compound glyph was a filing system. When the Egyptians needed to name something that did not fit an existing category, they built a new sign, and they built it precisely. This glyph does not fit an existing category. It does not correspond to any known deity, any known priestly title, any known ritual function documented across 4,000 years of Egyptian religious writing. Whoever carved it needed a designation that did not yet exist, which means whoever carved it was naming something they considered distinct enough to require one. And the physical description attached to that designation, the object hovering unsupported above the final course of stone, is not unique to this fragment. It reappears, described independently, in 2 other locations, recorded by cultures with no documented contact with dynastic Egypt and no access to this relief. That convergence is not something the ministry catalog entry accounts for, and it is not something the 2 passing conference references address. It is simply sitting there, unexamined, in a fragment nobody has looked at closely enough to ask why. The carved register itself is not ambiguous once you look past what it was assumed to be. It shows a construction sequence, not a burial rite, not an offering scene, not a procession honoring the dead, a sequence of placement. Figures positioned along the pyramid's upper courses with their arms raised toward the object above them, and every figure rendered the same way, palms open, empty. For decades, the 2 scholars who cited this fragment in passing assumed the raised arms posture was ceremonial, a gesture of veneration toward whatever the object represented symbolically. That reading required no further investigation. It filed the image under religious iconography and moved on, the same way Brugger's contemporaries filed the object itself under ceremonial, function undetermined. The posture was classified, the inquiry stopped. But that assumption rested on a comparison that had never actually been made, because no one studying this fragment had looked at raised arm postures in construction contexts outside Egypt. When you do look, the posture stops being ceremonial and starts being functional. Workers position their arms upward not to worship an object, but to receive it, to guide something being lowered into place from above. That is a working posture, not a devotional one. It appears in exactly this configuration nowhere else in the entire Old Kingdom corpus, not once, in 4,000 years of carved labor scenes, showing men hauling, levering, and dragging stone by hand. Every other construction scene in the Egyptian record shows effort directed outward and downward, ropes, sledges, ramps. This one shows effort directed upward, toward something that is doing the lowering itself. That is the detail that should have stopped a specialist in their tracks. Instead, it sat in an archive for 39 years, waiting for someone to notice that this construction method has no precedent anywhere else in Egypt. But it does have a precedent somewhere else entirely, 7,000 kilometers away, on a continent the Egyptians had no recorded contact with. In 2003, German archaeologist Dr. Werner Halsig published a field report in the journal Anatolian Studies, documenting an ongoing excavation at a site in the Zagros foothills of western Iran, a stone platform complex that predates the pyramid's construction by roughly 3,000 years and was, at the time, among the oldest deliberately engineered stone platforms known anywhere in the archaeological record. Among the carved basalt slabs at the site, Halsig documented a panel his team designated Slab 7, later referred to in subsequent literature as the Ascension Panel, for its depiction of figures with arms raised beneath an unidentified suspended form. In his field notes, Halsig logged the posture as a probable solar veneration gesture, classified the panel under ritual iconography, and moved on to other sections of the platform. There is no evidence in any published record that Halsig was aware of the Giza fragment. He was not looking for a parallel. He was cataloging a single panel among hundreds. And this is the one detail he happened to write down precisely enough for anyone to check later. Here is where it stops being a coincidence you can wave away. The raised arm posture on Slab 7 is not a loose visual echo. The angle of the forearms, the spacing between figures, the positioning directly beneath the suspended form rather than beside it, matches the configuration carved into the Giza fragment, detail for detail. 2 platforms, 1 culture. With no writing system and one with an elaborate one, separated by roughly 3,000 years and 2,000 kilometers of mountain and desert, with no trade route, no shared iconographic tradition, and no documented contact connecting them. And yet the same posture, receiving the same kind of unseen weight from above. That is not where the coincidence ends. It is where the measurement begins. In 2016, structural engineer Dr. Marisol Ferrand, who holds a doctorate from ETH Zurich, the same institution that holds Brugger's original field log, and whose peer-reviewed work on load-bearing stress in pre-modern masonry has been cited across 3 decades of construction history literature, presented an analysis at the International Symposium on Historic Structures in Lyon. Her subject was not Giza. It was the platform in the Zagros foothills, and specifically, the geometry of the raised arm posture on Slab 7. Ferrand measured the angle formed between each figure's forearm and the vertical plane of the platform wall. Across every instance on the slab, that angle held constant at 31 degrees from horizontal. She noted the consistency as structurally deliberate, the kind of repeated precision that does not occur by artistic accident across multiple carved figures on the same surface. What her presentation did not include, because the comparison had not yet been made in any published forum, was the angle formed by the identical posture on the Giza fragment. The forearms of the figures beneath the suspended object, measured against the same vertical reference, hold at 31 degrees. 2 platforms, a separation of 3,000 years and 2,000 kilometers of mountain and open desert. No shared writing system, no shared trade network, no known point of transmission, and the same angle, to the degree, carved by hands that could not have seen each other's work. Coincidence produces variation. This produced a constant, and a constant like that does not stay buried in a supplementary figure forever, because it was about to surface again, in a place no one was looking for it at all. And then there is the material evidence, which is where the question stops being purely iconographic. In 2014, a materials science team led by Dr. Anke Reiter at the Federal Institute for Materials Research and Testing in Berlin published a study in the Journal of Archaeological Science, analyzing residue samples taken from mortar and stone contact surfaces across 41 Old Kingdom construction sites, Giza included. The study confirmed known composition patterns, gypsum lime binders consistent with documented Egyptian quarrying and transport methods, and its findings were reported without controversy in the specialist press. What was not reported, what did not appear in the abstract or the discussion section or any subsequent citation of the paper, was a footnote in the appendix.
Appendix C, Sample GZ14. One sample, taken from the uppermost contact surface directly beneath where the final course of casing stone would have been set, showed a mineral signature that did not match gypsum, lime, or any binding agent used elsewhere at the site. The paper's authors flagged it in a single sentence: anomalous reading, likely contamination for modern conservation work, excluded from primary analysis. No follow-up sampling was conducted. No separate paper investigated the anomaly. The sample remains in cold storage, unresolved. The exact point that sample was taken from sits directly beneath the same course of stone depicted in the fragment recovered from the storage niche in 1987. The one Brugger photographed, the one no one has published a dedicated study on since. 2 evidence lines, recorded 15 years apart, by researchers with no knowledge of each other's work, converging on the same 11-meter stretch of the pyramid's upper courses.
One says, the posture carved there does not belong to any known ritual gesture. The other says, the material found there does not belong to any known construction process. Neither claim, taken alone, would trouble a specialist. Taken together, at the same coordinates, they are harder to file away. Now, the mainstream explanation for all of this deserves to be stated completely and fairly, because it is not a weak argument. Structural engineers and materials scientists would point out, correctly, that raised arm postures in construction iconography are common across unrelated cultures simply because they depict a common physical act. Workers guiding a load from below will naturally be rendered with arms upward, regardless of whether any 2 cultures ever met. Convergent gesture does not require convergent origin. As for the 31-degree angle, they would argue that a consistent carving angle across a single relief surface, or even across 2, is more plausibly explained by tool constraints, the geometry of a chisel held at a comfortable working angle, or simple artistic convention passed down within one workshop, than by any transmitted standard spanning 3,000 years. Angles repeat in carving traditions all the time. That is what a stable technique looks like, not what a transmitted blueprint looks like. And the material anomaly in Appendix C deserves the same scrutiny. Archaeological residue analysis is notoriously vulnerable to contamination, especially at sites that have undergone repeated conservation work involving modern adhesives, consolidants, and cleaning agents. A single anomalous reading, excluded by the paper's own authors as likely contamination, is not evidence of anything beyond the ordinary noise of fieldwork. One sample is not a pattern.
It is an outlier, and outliers get excluded for a reason. These are reasonable positions. They are the positions most credentialed researchers in these fields would defend, and on their own terms, they are sound. Independent gesture, tool-driven angle consistency, contaminated residue. Each explains its single data point without requiring anything unusual. What they do not explain is why all three sit at the same 11-meter stretch of the same structure. Convergent gesture does not require convergent origin, but it does not usually produce an identical angle to the degree either. And contamination does not explain why the one anomalous sample, out of 41 sites, happens to sit directly beneath the one carved posture that does not match anything else in the corpus. Isolated, each fact is unremarkable. Stacked at one coordinate, they stop being isolated.
Two independent evidence lines, an iconographic parallel matched to the degree, and a material anomaly buried in an unread appendix converge on the same 11 meters of stone, at a construction sequence that no other relief in the Old Kingdom record depicts the same way. The posture carved beneath the suspended object at Giza is not a gesture of worship. In its grammatical construction, it is closer to a working instruction than a prayer, a record of hands positioned to receive something being lowered, rather than hands raised toward something being revered. Whatever placed the final course of casing stone on this pyramid was not, in the minds of the people who carved this scene, entirely of their own making. The oldest courses of Giza were not built to honor a god in the way dynastic religion would later formalize that word.
They were built, this fragment suggests, in cooperation with something the builders did not fully understand, and chose to render precisely anyway, because precision was the only tool they had for recording what they could not explain. The fragment catalogued as GZ114/C remains in restricted storage at the Giza Site Museum, unexhibited since 1987. The anomalous sample from Appendix C of the 2014 Berlin study remains in cold storage, unresampled, its single flagged sentence the only acknowledgement it has ever received in the literature. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted along the pyramid's eastern flank in 2021, involving teams from Cairo University and a French geophysical consortium, identified a void directly beneath the 11-meter stretch in question, a void whose dimensions do not correspond to any known internal chamber or relieving space in the structure's published architectural record. The Ministry of Antiquities has classified the area as structurally sensitive, pending further assessment. No excavation permit has been issued. The assessment has been pending since 2021. Beneath the oldest and most exhaustively studied monument on Earth, in a stretch of stone that a photograph, a measurement, and a mineral sample all point toward without ever citing one another, the question of what was lowered into place and what helped lower it is still open, and no one has been given permission to